It all started on a quiet Thursday evening, the kind of evening that usually promised nothing more than a good book, a cup of tea, and the soft hum of suburban life. But for Ethan Carter, that evening would mark the beginning of a legal and personal battle he never saw coming. A battle that would pit him against one of the most manipulative and entitled individuals he had ever encountered, Margaret Maggie Harrington. Ethan lived in Willow Creek, a peaceful suburban neighborhood just outside of Atlanta. He had worked tirelessly for years as a software engineer, saving every penny to finally buy his dream home, a modest yet charming two-story house with a spacious driveway, a well-manicured front lawn, and, most importantly, a sense of privacy. Or so he thought. That evening, Ethan had just finished dinner and was settling into his living room with a novel when he heard it, a loud, violent crash that shattered the stillness of the night. The sound was so jarring that it made his stomach drop. For a split second, he thought it might have been a car accident on the main road nearby. But as the echo of the crash faded, he realized with a sinking feeling that the noise had come from his own driveway. Heart pounding, Ethan threw the book aside and rushed to the front door. As he stepped outside, the sight before him sent a wave of disbelief and anger coursing through his body. His brand-new Chevrolet Camaro, which he had parked neatly in his driveway, was now sitting at a grotesque angle, its front end completely smashed in. Just a few feet away was a white SUV, its front bumper crumpled from the impact. Standing beside it, looking completely unfazed, was none other than Maggie Harrington. Maggie was a well-known figure in Willow Creek. In her late 40s, she carried herself with an air of entitlement, always acting as if the entire neighborhood was her personal kingdom. She had a reputation for bossing people around, meddling in affairs that weren't her concern, and using her position as the vice president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, to make life difficult for anyone who didn't follow her unspoken rules. And now, she had just plowed into Ethan's parked car as if it were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle in her path. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to contain his frustration as he approached her. "Maggie, what the hell just happened?" he asked, gesturing toward his wrecked car. She let out an exaggerated sigh, folding her arms across her chest. "Oh, Ethan, calm down," she said in a tone that immediately set him on edge. "It's not a big deal. Your car shouldn't have been in the way." Ethan blinked, completely taken aback. "In the way? Maggie, my car was parked in my own driveway. You drove straight into it." She waved a dismissive hand, as if he were overreacting. "Well, I always use this spot to turn around. You should know that by now." She glanced at her SUV and then back at Ethan, as if expecting him to apologize for the inconvenience. "I didn't mean to hit it, obviously, but if you had just parked differently, this wouldn't have happened." Ethan could hardly believe what he was hearing. His car was destroyed, his driveway was littered with tire marks from her reckless turn, and yet she was acting like he was the one at fault. "Maggie, this is not my problem. It's yours. You crashed into my property. You're going to have to pay for the damages." Her expression shifted slightly, but instead of guilt, Ethan saw irritation. "Oh, come on, Ethan. It was an accident. Let's not make a big deal out of this," she said, rolling her eyes. "Besides, I don't see why I should have to pay for anything. It's just a car." Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "It's not just a car. It's my car. My brand new car that you just wrecked. I'm calling the police." That finally got a reaction out of her. Maggie's lips thinned, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. There's no need to involve the police over something so minor." Ethan pulled his phone out of his pocket, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "It's not minor, Maggie. You hit my car on my property, and now you're refusing to take responsibility. The police are going to document this, and your insurance is going to pay for the damage." Maggie exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed. "Fine. Do what you want," she muttered, crossing her arms even tighter. "But don't think for a second that I'm just going to accept this." Ethan ignored her and dialed 911, knowing that this was only the beginning of what would become a battle far bigger than he could have ever anticipated. As Ethan stood there with his phone pressed to his ear, Maggie continued to glare at him as if he were the one who had just rammed into her vehicle. The operator on the other end calmly took his information, and within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. A police cruiser rolled to a stop in front of Ethan's house, and two officers stepped out, one older and stocky, the other younger but sharp-eyed. Before Ethan could even say a word, Maggie rushed toward them, flipping the script before he had a chance to speak. "Oh, officers, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, clutching her chest dramatically. "This man is being completely unreasonable. I had a minor accident, and now he's trying to pin everything on me." Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm as the older officer turned his attention to him. "Sir, you're the one who called?" "Yes," Ethan said, nodding. "I was inside my house when I heard the crash. I came outside and found that she had driven straight into my parked car in my own driveway." He gestured toward the wreckage, still in the exact position it had been when the impact occurred. Maggie scoffed. "Oh, please. His car was parked in the worst possible spot. I was just trying to turn around like I always do. I barely tapped it." "Barely tapped it," Ethan repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "Look at the front end of my Camaro. It's completely wrecked. You weren't just turning around, Maggie. You were speeding and lost control." The younger officer glanced down at the damage, pulling out a notepad. "All right, let's start with the basics. Ma'am, were you driving this white SUV?" Maggie huffed. "Obviously. And can you explain exactly how the accident occurred?" Maggie crossed her arms, shifting her weight onto one foot. "Like I said, I was just trying to turn around. I've done it 100 times before, but his car was sticking out way too far, and I didn't have enough space. He's the one who parked in an inconvenient spot." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Inconvenient? It's my driveway. Where else am I supposed to park?" The officers exchanged glances. The older one knelt down, inspecting the impact points, while the younger one made a few notes. "Sir," he said, turning back to Ethan, "do you have any security cameras on your property? That was the one bright spot in all of this." "Yes, I do. The cameras above my garage should have caught everything." Ethan pulled out his phone and quickly accessed the footage. Sure enough, the video showed Maggie's SUV barreling into his driveway at a sharp angle, slamming straight into his parked car. He held out his phone so the officers could see. The younger one watched intently, nodding. The older officer sighed, shaking his head. "Well, that's pretty clear evidence," he muttered. "Ma'am, it looks like you were going too fast and lost control." Maggie's face darkened, and she quickly shifted tactics. "Well, how do I know that video hasn't been tampered with?" she snapped. "People can edit things these days. He probably doctored the footage just to make me look bad." The older officer let out an exasperated breath. "Ma'am, this is a police investigation. We'll be reviewing the footage ourselves, and we'll also take note of the tire marks on his driveway. From what we can see right now, this looks like driver error on your part." Maggie's mouth opened and closed as if she were searching for a comeback. Then she pointed a finger at Ethan. "This isn't fair. You're just siding with him because—" The younger officer cut her off. "Ma'am, do you have insurance?" Maggie's jaw tightened. "Of course I have insurance." "Then you'll need to file a claim. Based on the evidence, you're at fault for the accident, and your insurance will need to cover the damages." Maggie's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Oh, absolutely not. I'm not paying a cent for this. He set me up. His car was in the wrong place, and now he wants to milk me for money." The absurdity of her argument was almost laughable. "Maggie," Ethan said, struggling to keep his composure, "this isn't about milking anyone. You destroyed my car. Your insurance is supposed to cover the damage. That's how this works." Maggie shook her head furiously. "I refuse. I'm not paying, and that's final. If you think I'm just going to roll over and let you take advantage of me, you've got another thing coming." The officers exchanged another glance. The older one sighed. "Ma'am, refusing to file a claim doesn't make you any less responsible. If he decides to take this to court, you could be looking at a lawsuit." Maggie turned to Ethan with a smirk. "Then let him try." Ethan clenched his jaw. If that was how she wanted to play this, then so be it. He wasn't about to let her walk away from this mess without consequences. If she refused to do the right thing, he would make sure she was held accountable, one way or another. The morning after the accident, Ethan woke up still fuming over Maggie's blatant refusal to take responsibility. He had already called his insurance company to report the incident, and they confirmed that he would need to either file a claim against Maggie's policy or take legal action. Given her attitude, he knew she wasn't going to make this easy. Ethan walked outside to get his mail, his eyes lingering on the wrecked front end of his Camaro. It was a painful sight. The estimate for repairs was going to be steep, and there was no way he was letting Maggie off the hook for this. But as he pulled the stack of letters from his mailbox, something immediately caught his attention, an official-looking envelope from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. Ethan frowned, tearing it open. His irritation turned into disbelief as he read the letter inside. Notice of violation. Dear Mr. Carter, it has come to the HOA's attention that a vehicle has been left in a hazardous manner in your driveway, obstructing neighborhood access and violating community safety regulations. Homeowners are required to ensure that their driveways remain clear of obstructions that may interfere with the movement of vehicles within the neighborhood. Please remove the vehicle immediately to avoid further penalties. Failure to comply may result in fines or other corrective actions by the HOA. Ethan had to reread the letter twice, trying to process the sheer audacity of what he was looking at. His car wasn't an obstruction. It was a victim of Maggie's reckless driving. And now, instead of helping him hold her accountable, the HOA was trying to fine him. The pieces fell into place almost instantly. Maggie was the vice president of the HOA. Of course, this wasn't a coincidence. This was her attempt to shift the blame onto him. Anger simmered beneath Ethan's skin as he stormed back inside and grabbed his phone. He immediately dialed the HOA office. It rang a few times before a nasal, overly pleasant voice answered. Willow Creek Homeowners Association, this is Janet speaking. How can I help you? Janet, this is Ethan Carter. I just received a notice of violation about my car. Can you explain to me why I'm being fined for having my own vehicle parked in my own driveway when it was hit by another resident? There was a pause. Oh, Janet said, her tone suddenly hesitant. I believe that was discussed in yesterday's emergency HOA meeting. There were concerns about safety and how your car's placement contributed to it. Ethan cut her off. Are you serious? My car was legally parked. Maggie crashed into it, and instead of dealing with her, you're coming after me. Well, Janet said, clearing her throat, Maggie did bring up that your driveway is near a common turnaround point, and that perhaps the placement of your vehicle was a. Let me stop you right there, Ethan said, barely containing his frustration. There is no common turnaround point. That's just Maggie using my driveway as her personal parking lot. And now, because she doesn't want to pay for the damages she caused, she's using her position in the HOA to punish me instead. Janet hesitated again, but then her tone grew defensive. Mr. Carter, the HOA follows community regulations, and we can't get involved in personal disputes between neighbors. If you disagree with the notice, you're welcome to attend the next HOA meeting and present your case. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. Oh, don't worry. I'll be there. Ethan knew Maggie wasn't going to back down willingly, which meant he had to prepare for a legal battle. The moment she weaponized the HOA against him, it became clear she wasn't just trying to avoid paying for the damage, she was trying to intimidate him into dropping the matter entirely. But that wasn't going to happen. The first thing Ethan did was contact his lawyer, Daniel Reed, a no-nonsense attorney specializing in property disputes and civil cases. When Ethan explained the situation, Daniel let out a low chuckle. Well, Ethan, he said, you've got yourself a classic case of negligence mixed with a little HOA overreach. Good news, you've got strong evidence. Bad news. Maggie sounds like the kind of person who's going to fight tooth and nail just to save face. Ethan sighed. Yeah, that sounds about right. So what's our next move? Daniel outlined a strategy. First, Ethan needed to officially document everything, not just the police report and damage assessment, but also Maggie's attempts to manipulate the situation. That meant submitting a formal dispute against the HOA's violation notice, gathering statements from neighbors who had seen Maggie using his driveway before, and getting a full professional repair estimate for his Camaro to present in court. Ethan spent the next 2 days meticulously compiling everything. He called up a few neighbors, and sure enough, several of them were more than happy to confirm that Maggie had been using his driveway as her personal turnaround spot for years. One of them, a retired teacher named Mr. Jensen, even offered to write a statement detailing how he'd warned Maggie multiple times that she was driving too recklessly. She acts like the whole neighborhood belongs to her, Mr. Jensen told Ethan. People just don't push back because she makes their lives miserable when they do. But I'll back you up. Someone needs to put her in her place. With his statement, the security footage, and the police report in hand, Ethan's case was getting stronger by the hour. Daniel drafted a formal demand letter to Maggie's insurance company, outlining the damages and demanding full compensation. If she refused, the next step was filing a lawsuit. The letter was sent, and all that was left to do was wait. 2 days later, Maggie showed up at Ethan's doorstep. He opened the door to find her standing there, arms crossed, her expression twisted into an exaggerated smirk. "I see you're really going through with this," she said. "Dragging your little lawyer into it, making a big deal out of nothing." Ethan met her gaze evenly. "It's not nothing, Maggie. You wrecked my car and tried to blame me for it. You're the one who made this worse by refusing to do the right thing." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. Do you really think a judge is going to side with you? I have the HOA backing me up. And let me tell you something, Ethan. You don't want to be the guy who goes against the association." Ethan crossed his arms. "Let me tell you something, Maggie. You don't want to be the one caught abusing your position in the HOA. Because once I'm done with this lawsuit, you won't just be paying for my car. You'll be answering for every single time you've used your authority to bully people in this neighborhood." Maggie's smirk faltered for just a second before she scoffed. "Fine. Waste your time. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, she turned on her heel and stomped away. Ethan closed the door, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. Maggie was trying to act like she was still in control, but he'd seen the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She was starting to realize she had picked the wrong person to mess with. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Ethan was more than ready. Over the past 2 weeks, his lawyer, Daniel, had meticulously prepared their case. They had the police report, security footage, witness statements, and repair estimates, a rock-solid argument proving Maggie was at fault. But knowing Maggie, Ethan expected her to twist the situation however she could. She wasn't the type to admit guilt, even when the evidence was staring her in the face. As Ethan entered the courtroom, he saw Maggie sitting at the defendant's table, her arms crossed, lips pursed in irritation. She was dressed to impress, clearly trying to present herself as a respectable, responsible citizen. But the moment their eyes met, she shot him a glare filled with pure hostility. The judge, an older woman with a sharp gaze, entered the room, and the proceedings began. Daniel laid out their case with precision, presenting the security footage first. The courtroom remained silent as the video played, clearly showing Maggie's SUV barreling into Ethan's parked Camaro. The impact was undeniable. When the footage ended, Daniel turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this video clearly demonstrates that the defendant was driving recklessly and struck my client's legally parked vehicle on his private property. Furthermore, rather than accepting responsibility, she has attempted to evade liability and even engaged in tactics to intimidate my client through the homeowners association." Maggie's lawyer, a middle-aged man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, quickly stood. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges that the accident occurred, but we argue that Mr. Carter contributed to the incident by parking in an obstructive manner. The HOA had previously raised concerns about driveway usage, and my client had reasonable cause to believe she was navigating a commonly used turnaround area." Ethan clenched his jaw, but Daniel remained calm. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the idea that a homeowner is responsible for someone crashing into their parked car on their own property is absurd. The police report states that Mr. Carter's vehicle was parked entirely within his property lines, with no encroachment onto the road. Additionally, multiple neighbors have provided statements confirming that the defendant had a pattern of using my client's driveway improperly, despite knowing it was private property." The judge turned to Maggie. "Mrs. Harrington, can you explain why you were using the plaintiff's driveway as a turnaround spot?" Maggie straightened in her seat, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder as she put on her best performance. "Your Honor, I was just trying to get home. That part of the street is narrow, and sometimes it's hard to maneuver. I've used that spot before. Everyone in the neighborhood knows it's common practice." The judge raised an eyebrow. "So, you admit to using the plaintiff's private driveway as a turnaround?" Maggie hesitated, but then shrugged. It wasn't a big deal before. He never complained. Daniel seized the moment. "Your Honor, just because my client never confronted her before doesn't mean she had permission to use his property as her personal driving lane. The law is clear. Private property is not public space. And in this case, her habitual misuse of his driveway led to an accident that could have easily been avoided had she exercised proper caution." Maggie's lawyer quickly tried another tactic. "Even if my client was partially at fault, We argue that the plaintiff is exaggerating damages. The car is reparable, and the cost he's seeking is excessive. Daniel didn't even blink. The official repair estimate from a licensed auto shop is right here, Your Honor, he said, handing over the documents. And just to clarify, this isn't about just fixing the car. It's about holding the defendant accountable for her reckless actions and the emotional and financial burden she placed on my client by refusing to take responsibility. The judge skimmed the documents and then fixed Maggie with a hard stare. Mrs. Harrington, your SUV struck the plaintiff's parked vehicle. You were on his property. You knowingly misused his driveway. And now, instead of handling this properly, you forced this matter into a lawsuit. Do you have anything else to say in your defense? For the first time, Maggie looked genuinely flustered. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her usual bravado wavering. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just didn't think it was that big of a deal. The judge let out a slow breath and set down the papers in front of her. Well, it is a big deal, Mrs. Harrington, and now you're going to be held accountable. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Maggie was found fully liable for the damages to Ethan's car and ordered to pay the full repair costs, court fees, and an additional penalty for refusing to cooperate. The total came out to nearly $115,000, a number that wiped the smirk off her face instantly. As they exited the courtroom, Maggie tried to save face, turning to Ethan with an indignant glare. You really had to take it this far, didn't you? She hissed, her voice dripping with bitterness. Ethan stared at her, his patience long gone. You took it this far, Maggie. If you had just owned up to what you did from the start, we wouldn't be here. Maggie scoffed, but had no real comeback. With her pride shattered and her bank account about to take a major hit, she stormed off without another word. But her problems didn't end there. Word of the lawsuit spread quickly through the neighborhood, and the truth about what happened, her reckless driving, her lies, and her abuse of HOA power, became common knowledge. Neighbors who once tolerated her out of fear turned against her. Some started openly questioning her leadership in the HOA, while others, tired of her controlling ways, began pushing for her removal from the board. Within a month, the pressure became too much. Maggie resigned from the HOA, claiming it was to focus on personal matters. But everyone knew the truth. She had been forced out. And just like that, Maggie lost the influence she had wielded over the community for years. The very thing she had used to intimidate Ethan had become her downfall. With the lawsuit settled and Maggie effectively removed from power, Ethan finally felt a sense of closure. His Camaro was repaired, his legal expenses were covered, and best of all, he no longer had to deal with Maggie's antics. She had tried every trick in the book, manipulation, intimidation, and outright denial. But in the end, facts and accountability won. This whole ordeal taught Ethan a valuable lesson. Never let bullies go unchecked. Maggie had spent years using her position in the HOA to control and intimidate people, assuming no one would ever challenge her. She was so used to getting her way that she genuinely believed she could crash into his car, blame him for it, and walk away without consequences. But she was wrong. Ethan also learned the power of evidence and persistence. Without security footage, witness statements, and legal backing, Maggie might have actually convinced others that he was at fault. Instead, by standing his ground and methodically gathering proof, he made sure the truth couldn't be twisted in her favor. As for the neighborhood, things changed for the better. Without Maggie dictating every little rule, people felt more at ease. HOA meetings became less about control and more about actual community concerns. Neighbors who once stayed silent finally voiced their opinions. The fear Maggie had instilled in them was gone. And Maggie? A few months later, she put her house up for sale. She couldn't stand living in a place where she no longer held power. Ethan watched her moving trucks pull away one morning and smiled to himself. Justice had been served. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.